Photography is expensive, but it doesn't have to be. This is the Canon R100, Canon's cheapest new camera, costing just $480 brand new. Today, I want to find out if this camera is any good and if you should consider buying one. Let's get into it. When I held this camera for the first time, I couldn't help but be surprised by just how small it is. This camera is barely able to fit the RF mount, and if it wasn't for the built-in flash, I think it would bulge out the top. It's also very light, weighing just 356 grams. That's partially because it's so small, but it's also because this camera is made almost entirely out of plastic, with the only exception being the RF mount. Behind that lens mount, you will find this camera's 24.1 megapixel CMOS APS-C size sensor. And just showing my cards up front, this is my favorite part of this camera, and I think it takes amazing photos. Taking a brief tour of this camera, on the top, we find its one and only control dial, which I think is a huge disappointment, especially when you consider this camera does not have any kind of a touchscreen to offer additional controls. I really would have appreciated having at least 2 dials. Moving on to the back of the camera, we find that non-touchscreen, which also does not articulate in any way. This is a 1,040 dot screen and a 2.8 million dot EVF. Both of these I would say are serviceable at best. The screen is fine when you are looking directly at it, but because it doesn't articulate, it has very poor viewing angles, and that does become difficult if you're trying to shoot outdoors without using the EVF. The EVF, again, is fine. It's not laggy, which I think is a huge improvement, but it's also not a high refresh rate like we're seeing from some other competitors. Perfectly serviceable. Outside of the screen and EVF, you will find its non-customizable buttons, which there are 10 of, so I hope that you like how Canon's laid these out. On the sides, you'll find a selection of ports, including a full-size 3.5mm mic jack, which I think is a huge inclusion for a cheap budget camera like this. You will also find a USB-C port and a small HDMI port. Now, something that I think is very important to mention with the USB-C port on this camera is that you cannot use it for charging in any way. You can use it for updating the camera's software as well as using it as a webcam, I think, but that's about it. I think this is a huge missed opportunity on part of Canon because, to be frank, the battery life on this camera isn't great. So being able to plug this into a portable power bank while you go around and shoot, I think would be a huge bonus. And lastly, on the bottom of the camera, you will find its battery along with single SD card slot. The raw photos that come out of this camera, I think look great. The files are fairly malleable, the colors look nice, and I think you can push the ISO to about 3200 before the files get a little bit too grainy for my liking. It technically goes up to ISO 12800, but I will let you be the judge if this is acceptable or not. I also like that despite this camera being made out of plastic, it feels fairly substantial. I have slightly larger hands, so the grip of this camera isn't quite large enough for me, but it's still substantial enough that I never felt like I was going to drop this camera. I also am impressed with the autofocus on this camera. It's a dual pixel autofocus system, which I feel is fairly reliable. I'm sure that this is also going to heavily depend on what lens you're using with this camera, but in my experience, I've been happy with it. This unfortunately brings us to some things that I do not like. Something that I find very odd about this camera is that Canon has chosen to primarily advertise it as a video content creation camera, and I frankly just don't think that's accurate. I think the weakest part of this camera is its video capabilities. First off, because this camera doesn't have an articulating screen, you are not going to be able to monitor what the camera sees, whether you're in focus or what the framing is like. That makes it very difficult for recording yourself like this. The second thing I don't like is the 4K that comes out of this camera. The 4K comes with a heavy crop factor and terrible rolling shutter. I don't feel like I need to go into much detail on why this looks bad. It just looks bad. The 4K mode on this camera I would say is unusable and is nothing more than something they can put on the box to fool people. The 1080p mode, however, doesn't have the same crop factor, and it is a lot better with rolling shutter. However, that still does not fix the fact that this camera does not have an articulating screen, and this camera also doesn't have any kind of a log format to shoot in. So if you're wanting to take your video a little more seriously, I just think that this is a bad option. If you're wanting a dedicated video camera around this price range, you should look at the slightly more expensive R50, which fixes nearly all of these issues. It has a fully articulating screen and uncropped 4K. The last critique that I have for this camera actually doesn't have anything to do with the camera and more Canon's mentality towards APS-C in general. Canon has released 4 native APS-C RF lenses if you don't count the VR lenses, which I don't. They're all zoom lenses and they all have a very slow aperture. The mentality that Canon has with their lenses is that you buy these full frame, more expensive, larger lenses because eventually one day you're going to upgrade to a full frame camera. The problem that I have with this mentality is that it essentially robs you of the best parts of APS-C, that being smaller, cheaper lenses. Which again, if you are planning on upgrading to full frame one day, makes sense because you can bring these lenses over. Ultimately, should you buy this camera? If you ignore Canon's marketing and you buy this camera exclusively for photography and maybe some light 1080p video on the side, I think you could do a lot worse. And $480 I definitely think is reasonable, especially when you consider that no other competitor is even trying to compete at that price. I hope this video helped you decide whether or not this camera is right for you. Thank you so much for watching, and God bless.